tie things back to statute where we can, but there's some things where we're just never gonna be able to do it, and it ultimately comes down to our sort of judgment of, you know, what is practicable from a common sense perspective.
Okay, so at this point, I'm hearing striking that is a consensus. Okay. Let's see, district SU was merged within the last 2 fiscal years and is not a MUD or an MED. Is John gonna be?
Well, just, where is it in the language of the law?
Yeah.
I don't know, this isn't helpful of an observation, but the point of my observation last time, we were trying to create some principles that sort of allowed the board to go forward beyond what the law described. If you know, maybe the conversation is, do you want to have any principles or considerations at all?
Right.
You know, since we're almost
Yeah,
done
I'm
with
kind
the
of,
list
I'm
anyway.
kind
You
of
know,
on
I just, you
that
know,
point that maybe we should just vote to reconsider this and just
Yeah.
pull it from the table. You know, in the end, we're each gonna have to take our, apply our own judgment to it anyway, but,
If all we're adopting is just reaffirming the
Yeah.
law.
Yeah.
John?
Yeah. it seems like
That's
we're getting-
attractive, but we're in effect asked to
Looks like you're gonna have to.
evaluate the
Anyway,
secretary's
strike it.
proposals
Yeah.
and and amend them. The language, it doesn't use those words precisely, but it's, the only conclusion can be drawn is that we're to respond to the secretary's proposals. We're not actually asked to respond to the AGS's. And so I guess, how do you evaluate a proposal without a sort of a collective understanding as to on what grounds do we say yay or nay? You know, it's that business of, if you're hiring a new school superintendent, you don't just sort of say, well, anyone will do. You say, we prefer these and these characteristics. They're guidelines. So I think there's some utility in having consensus guidelines that give evidence that this is important to us, that is not. And
I would argue that the discussion we've had at the last meeting, in particular, and the discussion we're having now, it actually has, so even if we were to reconsider and scrap these principles, it's the actual discussion that we had in terms of coming to that collective understanding of how we're, because what these are, it's how we're interpreting both the law and the rules. And back to your point, John, about, you know, the example of a, you know, job description for superintendent, that is statute. The analog is what we have in statute and what we have in rules, but ultimately, when you're assessing a candidate, even though you're comparing against a job description, there's a judgment call we have to make. And these kind of fuzzy words around practicability, that's why we were tasked to do this job, and it just, you know, the process laid out in statute didn't say, you know, push it through a spreadsheet, and if everything comes back one way, you go down this path, or you go down this path. We were given this task so that we could make a judgment call, and I think that's what we're gonna be doing.
I think it is very separate from, part of this was also small school grants, which was very definite, it said metrics.
Yep.
So it was, we had to come up with metrics and come up with something very definitive. Stacy?
I guess, I mean, I love the principles, and it really got me thinking about a lot of different issues that are gonna come up over the next couple of meetings, but at the same time, as individually appointed members to a public board, I think it'll be hard to agree on all this between the 11 or 9 of us, or however you wanna decide that number. It'd be like a legislature deciding ahead of time how everyone's gonna vote. And, you know, so I think, you know, some will vote yes and some will vote no. I think at the end of the day, each person's gonna have their own explanation about why they voted for some and not others. You know, in looking ahead, you know, probably not the end-all be-all on this issue. It would probably go, you know, beyond us as far as like whatever happens over the next couple of meetings. You know, it's gonna be hard to collectively explain, you know, like legislative intent, they always say it's like interpreting the dreams of pharaohs, is the old quote. And, you know, I think each one of us, you know, one may vote for a proposal because of certain issues, like, they think the debt load is reasonable. And another one will vote against it because they feel like the vote of the community was an important factor in that. So I really do like these principles, but at the same time, I don't know if we necessarily have to come to a landing on these in order to move forward. I think in the end, a motion will be put on the table, and we're gonna have to explain through that motion why we accepted the secretary's proposal or why we veered off of it, and then after that, we'll take a vote. And we hear this term democracy quite a bit through the last couple of meetings. I think in the end, it will be a democratic process. There's 9 of us, so that's by design, so that we don't have tie votes. So if 5 of us vote for something, it'll happen.
John?
I'm coming around. I'm just slower than the rest of you. I think it may be worth standing back and saying, remember, all we're doing here was trying to understand or articulate what we might have meant by the word practicable.
Yeah.
But that ain't the only game in town. In fact, the main game in town is the proposal before us showing promise of achieving the goals of the act? And that really is our main, I think, test. And those goals are fairly explicit. And so I guess the way it's set up, we have to look at the Secretary's proposal and ascertain if it shows promise of achieving the goals of the act. But that gets also to the question, but maybe so do the AGS proposals, and so hadn't we ought to look at them and see if they achieve the goals of the act? So that's down the road, but all I'm trying to remind us is that this is just trying to define one word, but that word is not dispositive about our decision. Our decision really is determined by the probability that any given proposal in fact advances the goals of the act.
And in many cases in the Secretary's report, she does use that this is practicable or not because it meets the goals of 46. So, I mean, that's a lot of the language that's in the Secretary's report. Stacy?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought us back to the Secretary's report, because that's, what I'm thinking now is that I think what I liked about our process last month, or 2 weeks ago, whatever that was that these were parts of rationale that came up in the Secretary's report. And what I think we were doing that I appreciate was we were objectively looking at each of those rationales, not tied to school X, but looking at just as a rationale, does this make sense? It was like to keep the analogy game going, I keep thinking of like a colander, like we're sifting, and for different plans, some of these various things, kind of like, ooh, what about that? Ooh, what about that? And I appreciated that we kind of objectively looked at all of these as possible considerations that would cause us to look deeply into the Secretary's rationale. So I think kind of whichever way John wants to go, I can go with. But I think it was an important exercise because it had us look at what is the rationale, or these rationales that make sense to us, regardless of what particular communities they're tied to, just as principles, or not principles, siftings.
Peter?
I just think this is a really healthy discussion, and it's probably more deliberative than even the legislature put into these issues, and here we are about to set forth, but I think this has been a very healthy discussion.
Mark?
I agree.
Bill? Okay.
So is there a decision about what John
Scrap
Skirkey suggested?
guidelines?
Or Oliver did?
I
Oliver?
think, well, John suggested it, but I'm just in the spirit of moving
can own
forward.
it, Oliver, if you want.
I'm gonna move that we reconsider the vote we took at the last meeting to adopt this working draft.
I would second that.
So I'm just wondering, if we would want to have any legal counsel on that, or is that, I mean, because you brought that up earlier.
Yep, no, that's a fair point. So perhaps I'll withdraw my motion and replace it with a motion to, if Chair feels appropriate at this point, to move into executive session to seek legal counsel.
Second
Okay,
that.
you second that, and all in favor, please say aye.